in halfway through. Just to quickly give you a brief overview of the course, Letitia and I designed it together with colleagues in Design, Engineering and Architecture at the National University of Singapore when we both worked at the Center for English Language Communication. So we're just going to be talking you through that design process and how we went about creating multimodal resources. So first I'm going to start off today by looking at the interdisciplinary curriculum design process, and then I'm going to be looking at the multimodal and intersemiotic communication strategies we brought in. So we drew on a number of different theoretical frameworks from Legitimation Code Theory and Systemic Functional Linguistics. We're just going to touch on a few of them. And what we're going to focus on in the second half of the presentation is really looking at the materials that we developed, the actual teaching materials, and also looking at the work that the students did in the class with the materials that we gave them in order to look at different artifacts in their disciplines and apply the frameworks that we introduced to them in those artifacts. So just to give you an overview of the course, so this was an interdisciplinary curriculum that was developed with architecture, engineering, and design as part of the College of Design and Engineering at NUS. It was a newly created college, and their focus was on really bringing the different disciplines together and making them sort of able to talk to each other. So bringing each of the disciplines out of their individual silos. We were brought in as the sort of English language communication team to come and put in all the knowledge about language into the curriculum and to help them develop their assessment, etc. So it was a large interdisciplinary team that had to collaborate throughout the semester. So the focus of the module was on making explicit to students how they could draw on visual and verbal resources to clearly articulate the valued knowledge in their disciplines. Particularly in speaking to specialist and non-specialist audiences in a succinct manner. And the assessment was a poster presentation with the support of a brochure. So we were looking at really complex multimodal artifacts here in terms of what the students were required to create. Very much valued in disciplines like engineering, where at the end of their entire 4 years, they have these exhibitions in which students have to give poster presentations on work that they've done in their area of expertise. So we had lecturers joining us from a bunch of different disciplines, and our approach as literacy experts was really about talking to the disciplinary experts from engineering, architecture, and design, and asking them how they view texts in their particular discipline. So we were interested in looking at what they thought of as being excellent examples of texts and speaking to them about what they thought were the students' difficulties in relation to communication within these disciplines. So just to give you an example, technicality was a big issue that turned up, particularly in a discipline like engineering, where students are very sort of used to talking to people within their specialization. So lecturers wanted the students to be able to speak outside of their discipline to audiences who weren't experts in engineering. And to do this in a way that was engaging. There was a lot of discussion about things like how can students win grants, startup money, etc. at the end of their degrees. So it was about giving them the tools to do that. And we started by collecting excellent samples. We compared these excellent samples to weaker samples. We talked to the disciplinary lecturers about why they selected these particular examples. We wanted to know about what they thought was valued communication in their disciplines. We also analyzed professional communication. Again, we spoke to the lecturers about bringing in what they thought was excellent professional communication in the public domain. So things like Steve Jobs' iPhone talk, the launch of the first iPhone, then the 3-minute thesis, which some of you may already be familiar with because your universities might have it. So that's the competition in which the students present their PhD theses in 3 minutes. So it's a very challenging competition, particularly in terms of dialing down technicality and being engaging to a public audience. And we also looked at, and we'll be showing you examples from the 3MT competition and Build Your Own Pavilion. So the Fujimoto and Engels Build Your Own Pavilion, it's just a series of YouTube talks on architects talking about their vision for this particular design concept. So I'm basically going to go through the analytical frameworks. There's a lot of analytical frameworks that we could pick from to create the kinds of classroom activities that we wanted to build. And I'm just going to flip through them quickly because I want Letitia to be able to talk about them in relation to the actual examples of how we use that as teaching strategies. The two frameworks that we drew on heavily are systemic functional linguistics and legitimation code theory. Based on our discussions with the lecturers, we picked what we thought would be useful from those two theories to actually make explicit to the lecturers the kinds of resources, language, in terms of knowledge about language that would be valued and useful in their disciplines. In terms of our overall curriculum building, we were looking at the teaching and learning cycle. So we wanted to be able to take the students through a couple of different things. The first being deconstruction, which is looking at models and providing explicit knowledge about structure and language. So the models that I talked about, the 3MT, the YouTube videos, we want to give students the ability and frameworks that they could use to analyze those models, deconstruct them, and think about the kinds of language and images that were being used in them. So that's what we're going to focus on today's talk. There's a hugely complex number of theories that we wanted to look at, but I'm going to look at the more simplified versions of that, particularly legitimation code theory. I've already seen a talk on that. So Judith just gave a talk on that in the second strand just a few minutes ago, and she was talking about applying legitimation code theory to texts. It's a useful theory to sort of enter into this arena of how do you look at technicality, and not just technicality, but how technicality can be dialed down or dialed up depending on the audience that you're speaking to. So we'll look at how something as complex as systemic functional linguistics and multimodality and intersemiotics, huge fields with complex theories associated with them, can be unpacked and made more accessible to students in relation to LCT. So I'll just be showing you how we went about doing that. So in terms of LCT, I'm going to be looking at semantic gravity. It overlaps with these two concepts in systemic functional linguistics, very recently developed into mass and presence. So from a 2024 publication on science and infographics in science specifically. We are also interested in looking at this concept of intersemiotic complementarity. So we don't want to just look at it in terms of what is language doing and what is image doing, but what are they doing together and how do they distribute the load of technicality? So does language become more technical when visuals are more concrete, or does it happen the other way around? How do they support each other in getting meaning across is what we were interested in. So legitimation code theory gave us a common language of description. It's a sociological framework which explores knowledge practices, and there are multiple dimensions. We picked semantics from these dimensions because there's a growing LCT literature on academic literacy and EAP, particularly in using semantics. Very briefly, to go through this aspect of the theory, what we see here in terms of semantic gravity is how we can map the concept of context dependency. So how tied is something to the concrete, to concreteness and the context, or how abstract is it? So SG minus shows you abstraction, SG plus shows you concreteness. And as you can see, there are two what we call flat lines, high and low flat lines, A1 and A2 on that image. A1 shows you too much abstractness, and A2 shows you too much context dependence. Typical of a student's descriptive essay where they're just describing things, they're just explaining things to you, but they're not going back to the original concepts. Now, what we want students to do and what excellent texts tend to do is to move through the wave. So it usually goes from abstraction to concreteness and back up to abstraction again. So this is what we're talking about as a useful tool, something that we gave students, the semantic wave, to start thinking about the concepts that you are seeing on the next few slides. So SFL, mass, and presence. I'm just going to go through presence briefly for you, just to show you that even when it comes to something that's deeply theoretical and very recent in the literature, what you can do is ask a few questions. They ask about what they call key variables in relation to each of these different types of mass. So if you look at the prompt questions, they actually make it very accessible to get into a text, even for students. Asking questions about to what extent does the text unfold by mirroring what is talked about? So verbs are used as verbs, nouns as nouns. To what extent does text engage in dialogue or express emotion? Of course, we know that less emotion if it's more technical and abstract, more emotion if it's more public and supposed to be engaging for a non-specialist audience, and things like exaphoric references. So how does the text talk about the immediate environment in which it's produced. So these are some of the questions that you can ask, and there's a great deal of technicality that can come in, but there's also ways of simplifying it. So one of the reasons why we brought in these different frameworks was because we were interested in seeing how students can move between these two sort of frameworks, two levels of language, I'd say. So abstraction and concreteness, and technicality and less technical. So if you look at these two images, this is from the 3-minute thesis, Matthew Shaw. It's the same student talking about his work. The first image is, of course, much more relatable to us. It's the view of the Earth from the moon. Gives us an idea that he's talking about something in relation to space. And the second image, incredibly inaccessible, super dense and technical. All we know is we have an idea that it's in the field of science. He's wearing a lab coat. He's trying to make it more engaging by smiling and wearing a fun mask. But I think at the end of the day, we understand that this is within a very specific, highly technicalized field. And Matthew is an extractive metallurgist, someone who looks at how to extract metal from rocks. So the fact that he is able to make it more engaging and interesting, as he does in that first slide, the questions that we need to ask really are about how does he do that by using the kinds of images and language that he does. So if we look at it just in relation to image, we can think about things like how does the image depict what we can observe, so things that we can see and understand, as opposed to the second image, which is very technical. And very briefly, things like asking questions like, how does he try to engage us? The first image is engaging. The second one, maybe not so much to people who are outside the discipline. So this is basically the, and I'm getting to the section where Letitia is going to come in now and start to talk about different aspects of how we looked at this in relation to student text. But if we have a look at how we worked out these concepts in relation to actual language features and visuals, so bringing in the two modes. So we were looking at things like what kind of genre, so it is a non-specialized audience, what kind of genre, how is the technicality unpacked, how is it engaging or persuasive or informative, versus with a specialized audience, how much is the technicality a lot higher, more densely packed, and what are some of the features that we can see in language. So we were interested in allowing the students to have access to these kinds of descriptions of what was actually happening within the text, so that then we could allow them to have a toolbox from which they could draw, so that when they are developing their own presentations and their own text, they could think about it in terms of how engaging am I being, or how technical am I being? How do I unpack that depending on which audience there's, which is something that Arlene was talking about in relation to the kinds of multimodal resources that she thought was useful. So we really wanted to look at it in relation to how we can build this up in terms of looking at the kinds of artifacts that the students are supposed to produce and building up their knowledge about language and their understanding of technicality and how knowledge works within their disciplines, to allow them to produce excellent examples in their, when they start to build up their assessment. So I'm just going to let Letitia now go through the different kinds of activities that we did in the classroom. You're muted, Elle.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I'll show you just briefly how these translated into concrete class activities and materials we wanted the students to engage with, so that they would become familiar with those different communication strategies. So we used Semantic Gravity as an overall framework along with genre. So the text they would analyze would be first framed within this, and then within those broad frameworks, they would then look into more detailed multimodal combinations of strategies in relation to technicality. So Semantic Gravity and language resources. So I'll show you. Oh, can you move the slide now, please? Okay, and a bit more. So these are two examples of very short, simple products from two very famous architects who present how to design a pavilion. I won't give you too much detail about this. So basically, students were asked, what is the overall kind of purpose? What's the perceived audience? Next slide, please. Now, I think there's a bit of building up as well. You can go and send everything. Yeah. So this would be the type of handout the students would be given, and they would watch those short 3-4 minute videos, and then they would map on the semantic range the degree of technicality in each of these talks. So I can show you, the next slide shows you students' work. So obviously they always have a bit of fun with that. So this really triggered very interesting conversations, because we were able to compare how the different speakers used those resources. So it was fairly simple. There was the script and the gestures, the demonstration to form this pavilion. And they were very different in a way in how they addressed what they perceived were the needs of the audience. Okay, so these were fairly simple things to analyze, and we went on to things that are more reflective of what the students will be doing at the end of their studies. So a poster, an exhibition, maybe a prototype to demonstrate, and a talk. So I've heard from Jennifer and another speaker where we looked at how complex this is with the range of modes interacting. But we were interested to look at it in terms of how each contributes to pack or unpack technicality. So the first thing would be so this is an example of an engineer talk. It's a TED talk, quite short. So we would have it on a timeline like this, again, semantic gravity, where the first approach to the text would be, where is the technicality? Where does it increase or decrease? But then they would go back to it and map the visuals and the scripts together so that we could discuss how the two collaborated. So that for the students is really, really useful, because they can then make those kind of decisions very deliberately. If they are bringing in something quite complex visually, what are they going to do with their strategy, with their verbal strategies to unpack this so that the audience is still following, and vice versa. So it gave them, I think, a lot of knowledge in how to manipulate those visuals. So we found, for example, that the images tended to come very fast because there's not much to process. So they went very fast, accompanied, illustrated the speech, as opposed to a more complex infographic that would slow down the visual, and the speech would be there to unpack that complexity. So that kind of relation was really interesting to discuss. And then the students were then asked to implement those strategies into their own end of semester project. I'm not sure. Okay, so this is, in fact, this was the sort of the handout that went along with this. The script was given, visuals were given, and then the students were asked to work on the relation. So, and I'm sorry, because here the formatting went all crazy. So they're not completely aligned, but you can see that occasionally, so you can see the pictures are illustrating. So you have like a comparison before and after for the garden this engineer created. You can see it slows down with the infographic, and the script takes over to spend more time on unpacking this. So yeah, that's what we did with these students. And I think, I've heard in previous talks this morning, how concretely we can bring that kind of multimodal knowledge to the classroom. So that is one way we tried to do it. But we needed those theories to actually ourselves see what was happening. So without intersemiosis, it's quite difficult to make it up. So that's why it's so useful to have things like SFL or LCT. I think that is it now. I'm not sure, I can't remember. Yes. Okay, these are final products from these students. You have on the right the poster. In the middle, it's the brochure, which also was a lot of work, because the information provided on the brochure had to be a bit extended. The language was slightly different, much more visual infographic on the poster. And we thought, it's something important to say, but then I'm done. But because we had engineers, architecture students, and designers in the classroom, we found that this was a great way for them to talk to each other, because they are so, in fact, in terms of technicality, they're so different, as Nam was saying. Engineers come in with a lot of technicality and more ease with that. Designers less, and architecture are somewhat in the middle. And so we found that if we actually, made all that visible to them and presenting it not as something that is normal for their own discipline, but more like resources that they can choose from according to the audience and the purpose. Yeah, that would give them a bit more choice and agency over the way they communicate. I think that's all my voice. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Namala and Letitia. The room is open for questions. I'm going to stop the recording now. Any questions from the room?